This RealAg Radio podcast is brought to you by Authority Strike Herbicide from FMC. One application of Authority Strike Herbicide delivers a powerful one-pass burn-off to start, followed by extended weed control later. See your local retailer today for more information.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio. Welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. Shaun Haney, your host here on this Tuesday, or Wednesday, I should say, edition of the show. It's that kind of week. Thank you so much for making RealAg Radio and Rural Radio 147 a big part of your workday. And special treat today, we have a live audience, as you've heard. We are at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture meeting in Ottawa, Ontario. It is our nation's capital, and we're going to be digging into some big issues that are impacting the industry of agriculture really across the country. Today's show is brought to you by MNP. You deal with many uncertainties on your farm. Managing risk should not be one of them. MNP's ag team specializes in risk management. Visit mnp.ca to learn how you can stay ahead of the game and plan for the unknown. Make sure you go to mnp.ca. Our focus today is on geopolitics, and we've heard a lot about geopolitics a lot on this show. And really we're going to focus on how it impacts the great industry of agriculture. You know, we have multiple wars going on in different parts of the world. We have definitely massive immigration flows happening, some of it legal, some of it very illegal. And we also have growing trade protectionism really in a lot of some of our major trading partners' regions. All that and a whole lot more. We're going to tackle many of those topics today related to geopolitics. And along with the CFA, we have assembled a wonderful lineup of guests. Get ready. This is like some newsmakers, some heavy hitters in the industry. We've got a one-on-one conversation with Steve Verheul. He's with GT and Company. Now, Steve, I would say he's very famous. It tells you kind of the stuff that I'm following. He is the former chief trade negotiator for Canada. So this is the guy on CETA, the CPTPP, the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement. He was in the room. He was across the table from some of the toughest negotiators in the world, and he's going to shed some light on how geopolitics is impacting trade and trade negotiations. Then we're going to dive into a panel. Okay, we got Tyler McCann. He's the managing director of CAPI, with the Canadian, which is the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. We also have Stuart Person, senior vice president for agriculture with MNP, and we have Darrell, who's the CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs. If you have any feedback on today's show, because I know you always have something to say about what you've heard on the program, whether you agree, disagree, you got a bit of a burr under your saddle, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or of course you can find us across all the social media platforms, or you are more than welcome to call the RealAg feedback line, and that number is 855-776-6147. Let's take a break, and when we come back, let's dig into some trade issues with Steve Verheul. You're listening to RealAg Radio, brought to you by MNP.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and this segment is all about Koch Agronomic Services. And joining me on the line is Tom Barry. What are nitrogen stabilizer considerations then under uncertain weather, particularly dry conditions or persistent drought conditions?
Well, that brings in twofold, right? The first two times when you really want to be considering them, like I said, are broadcast or shallow banded applications. The second consideration is drought. And the second consideration, even though we don't have a whole lot of snow right now, is if you are in an area that has moisture, is denitrification or leaching, even though leaching doesn't occur as much as people think it does in Western Canada. But that's when you want to use a product that has a nitrification inhibitor in it.
So remind us then, what products from Koch Agronomic Services should farmers be considering as they sit down to work through these scenarios?
So if it's wet or going to be a little bit more moist in the spring, you're going to want to use a dual inhibitor from Koch Agronomic Services. And if it's on a drier bias, you're going to want to use a urea inhibitor.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio, broadcasting today from the CFA meeting in Ottawa, Ontario, brought to you by MNP. We're now going to dive into some trade issues related to geopolitics. And honestly, I can't think of a better person to provide some perspective on this issue because, well, this is the guy that actually knows what's going on because he's in the room. So as Canada's chief trade negotiator, Steve Verheul was responsible for negotiating the new NAFTA agreement, the USMCA. In Canada, we call it the CUSMA. Maybe we'll get into why this thing has so many names. And the Canadian-European Union Trade Agreement, CETA. He was Canada's chief agriculture negotiator from 2003 to 2009, responsible for leading Canada's involvement in international trade negotiations on agriculture, including at the WTO. Like I said, heavy hitter. Steve, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I have so many questions. We could go for 3 hours. We talked on a phone call, and we're like, okay, we got to dial this back, Shaun. You're too excited. 100,000 feet. Have geopolitics always played such a prominent role in trade and the negotiations of better trade?
No, they haven't. I think that back a number of years ago, the consensus was we needed to keep politics out of trade and let the markets operate trade and the rules operate trade, and the whole idea of negotiating trade rules was to keep political decisions out of it. And there was general buy-in on that across the world, almost all countries, but that has definitely changed.
Does this put Canada at a disadvantage?
It absolutely does, because I think Canada as a mid-sized country relies on rules and trade to be on a level playing field with the U.S. and China and Europe and other countries that are much bigger, carry much more power. So we need politics kept out of it. We need rules-based trade. And if it's an environment where it's just the law of the jungle, then the larger countries are going to have a much easier time than we will.
Yeah, that's been my perception, is it's easy for example, let's pick on the U.S. because, south of us, largest economy in the world. We do a lot of trade with them. We compete with them. It is much easier for them to sort of be the bully in the room. Like, if you don't do this, we're going to do that. That's tougher for Canada to throw its weight around. We're, geographically, we're a large country, but from an economic power standpoint, we don't have some of those advantages. Is that fair?
That's absolutely fair, which is why not only do we need rules-based trade and rely on those rules to help level that playing field, but we also need to work with allies. So we're not that powerful on our own, so we need to have alliances with similar countries with similar interests. Sometimes that's the bigger ones, like the U.S. on some issues, or Europe on some issues. But we also need to work with other mid-sized countries that have the same kinds of concerns.
Okay, so that's the multilateral approach, which is like the agreements where we have multiple countries all in one agreement, the CPTPP, USMCA. But the U.S. and China have been moving forward more on a bilateral strategy. That's different. Why is that, and should Canada be pursuing that method?
Well, there has been a large growth in bilateral agreements. There's been a large growth in bilateral relations and efforts, and Canada does that and needs to continue to do that. And that's probably where our most important efforts need to take place, particularly our bilateral relations with the U.S. as our largest trading partner, but also our allies in Europe and others. The U.S. doesn't have much of a bilateral relationship with China right now.
Right,
So it's more an issue of tension than any kind of collaboration on issues.
It's a bit of a roller coaster between the two of them. It feels. One week it's like, oh, we're back on, and the next week we're back off. It's like a junior high school dating relationship, it feels at times.
Yeah.
I like to make comparisons. I'm not sure if that's an accurate one, but anyway. Okay. Now, I mentioned the WTO earlier. You said rules-based trade. When I think of rules-based trade, I think of the WTO, or what we aspire the WTO to be again. How much reformation has to happen at the WTO level so it can enforce that rules-based trade that you're talking about?
Well, I think the WTO at the moment is kind of fundamentally broken. Dispute settlement is not working because the U.S. has blocked the formation of appellate boards. So there's no effective dispute settlement. There's no real effort to try to move any kind of negotiations forward successfully. There's a WTO ministerial happening right now, and there's very little coverage of it because there's very little happening.
Expectations are low. Is that why?
Expectations are low, and there's just the divisions, the gaps between positions are just simply too large at this point.
Okay, so for Canada, we believe in rules-based trade. We hear from both sides of the aisle, the political aisle, I should say. If we have little faith or low expectations on the WTO being effective, what levers does Canada have to play as geopolitics are really infiltrating trade discussions?
Well, I think we're putting less efforts into the WTO these days for those reasons, but a lot more effort into our bilateral relationships. And certainly we still have trade rules in CUSMA or USMCA or whatever you want to call it. I mean, those rules are extremely important to us now, as are our rules with the EU and others where we have trade agreements. So bilateral trade agreements are functioning somewhat better than the WTO, but still have more weaknesses than they used to.
Okay, so a couple things I really want to pinpoint on here that are definitely in the news from a trade perspective, and there's some geopolitics around them. We're going to have a renegotiation in 2026 of the CUSMA agreement. The last renegotiation felt incredibly painful and long.
It was.
Is this you were in the room. You probably have a lot of stories you can tell us. Maybe over beer later you can share those with me. But what does this look like? Is this a repeat performance?
Well, I want to start by saying it's not actually a renegotiation. It can be a renegotiation, but it's not required to be. On July 1st, 2026, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico are going to have to confirm in writing that they want the agreement to continue. And if that just happens without much else going on, then we're full steam ahead. If one of those countries decides they're not going to formally commit to the continuation, then we're into a world of uncertainty because the agreement will be in a state of having to be reviewed every year on an ongoing basis until something changes or it expires in 10 years. But I think beyond that, there's an expectation that as we lead up to July 1st, 2026, the U.S. in particular will start pushing for some kind of changes. So there could be a negotiation that develops, and there could be a forward work plan coming out of that.
If we were to talk to Las Vegas, I would assume that the smart money would be betting that Democrat or Republican, the U.S. is not just rubber stamping this and moving forward. It's very politically appealing in the U.S. right now as protectionism grows to say that, hey, this isn't working out for us. We need to fix this. We're getting, we're getting screwed on the trade deal. Is that fair, or am I getting way ahead of myself?
No, I think our hope is that there will be bigger issues that countries are focused on, and this will be a little bit more under the radar, but I think that's wishful thinking. I think that the U.S. will seek to make some changes and try to get Mexico and Canada to make some commitments during those discussions. And I think the one issue that really concerns me is that I keep hearing rumblings, particularly out of the Trump camp, that they may try to overturn some of the dispute settlement decisions through the review.
Because the big one in this room that everybody's aware of is on the dairy dispute resolution panels, the two of them, Canada claimed victory. Now on the first one, U.S. claimed victory as well, which is always interesting when both sides win. But in the second one, Canada felt like the winner and the U.S. acknowledged that. But that's getting back to the rules-based trade. Rules as long as my side wins. Is that one of the challenges here?
That is one of the challenges, because I think we've seen the U.S., maybe more than most other countries, becoming less attached to the rules of law if it interferes with their domestic objectives. And so that's going to be the challenge going forward.
Okay, I got to ask you. Somebody's like, you got to ask him. Other people are like, don't ask him. I'm going to ask him. Bill C-282. This is the piece of legislation that would basically, somebody like yourself, the trade negotiator, would have legislation where you couldn't give up further market access for supply managed commodities. You have sat in many negotiating rooms. Is this an effective way for Canada to defend supply management?
Well, it is a tricky question. I think from a negotiator's perspective, you never want to go to the table and immediately take things off if you can avoid it. Because then the other side, of course, has an opening to take things off on their side. But when you start those negotiations, each side always has its red lines. They're usually not a surprise, so you negotiate from there. So I really see this more as a political signal of support to the dairy sector and to supply management more broadly, because we've really already negotiated with most of the major dairy exporters to Canada. We have the U.S., New Zealand, Australia, Europe. So there's no other imminent threat out there. I think the era of the big negotiations is probably over for the foreseeable future. So I don't think there's actually an imminent threat coming. And I think that this is, about politics, about expressing support. I don't expect it's going to have a huge impact on what limited negotiations we have going forward.
Okay, that kind of makes sense, and that's kind of what I've heard. Like what I've heard out of the U.S. when I talk to people in D.C. is the main question I get is, what are you guys doing? Because if you were to do this, it's sort of like when you tell your kid they can't have the candy, right? It actually, what does the kid want? The kid wants the candy more.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the comparison that I've heard from a lot of people on that. Now, from a geopolitical standpoint, as we see geopolitical issues rise related to trade, one of the things that scares me, and maybe you're going to reassure me here, but we're hearing a lot about carbon border adjustments. But as we see geopolitical and protectionism rise, this feels like a really scary proposition for people to be using sustainability as a shield in front of protectionism. What are your thoughts on carbon border adjustments?
Well, I think there's a number of efforts being made, and certainly carbon border adjustment is one of them, to try to find a way to resolve a situation where if a producer is having to pay significant additional costs to meet sustainability objectives, they're not going to want to compete with imports from another country where none of that is being done. So they could price themselves out of the market just by all the extra expenses they're having to pay. So I think there is a need down the road, particularly as this advances further, that there's some kind of mechanism to try to account for that, so that producers that are doing all the environmental measures that they're being asked to take and adding expenses to their operations as a result shouldn't have to compete with imports from a country where the producer is doing none of that, facing none of those costs. So I think the challenge right now is that carbon border adjustment I don't think is the right solution. The U.S. has ideas of forming a small club and imposing tariffs against countries that are not meeting those objectives. So something needs to be done, but there's no coherent effort right now. I think there needs to be a broader, more coherent effort to try to decide, how do we resolve this? How do we make this adjustment? Okay,
final question, then we're going to get to our panel, but when you're in a trade negotiation, I imagine what that's like. We've all sat down and tried to buy a car, and we've bartered back and forth. What really? It's not like that. But really, what is it like in that room when you're trying to? You really have the economic. Canada's a very trade-dependent nation, so you have a lot of our GDP is dependent on what you negotiate. Mm-hmm. It's on your shoulders. So what does it really look like inside that room?
Well, the rooms vary a lot. The negotiations that I did with the European Union, it was fairly collaborative, fairly constructive. We're aiming for more or less the same kind of targets, and it was about moving towards freer trade. The negotiations with the U.S., it was the complete opposite. The U.S. was seeking to rebalance the agreement and take away things from Canada and from Mexico and scale back on freer trade, more restrictive. So it was a much more tense, much more confrontational kind of atmosphere in that room, and it did become quite heated at times. The gaps were quite wide. So it varies on the negotiating partner, it varies on the issue.
Very cool. Well, Steve, I really appreciate you joining us here on the program. I hope we get a chance to talk in the future. I have so many questions for you, but I got to get to our panel. Thanks so much for joining us here, Steve. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Okay.
We'll be right back on RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM, brought to you by MNP.
I'm
Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern. It is time for a product spotlight. With me now, I've got Tyler Gullen. He's the Technical Services Manager, Western Prairies for New Farm. You can't go far without having a discussion on resistant weeds, herbicide-resistant weeds in Western Canada, specifically kochia. So how has New Farm been working on solutions to help farmers navigate the kochia and greater herbicide resistance challenge?
So New Farm's been working really hard on combating herbicide resistance for a long time, and something we did recently was rediscovered a lost herbicide in the process that we coined Duplosan. So Duplosan is a Group 4 herbicide active, a systemic good Group 4 herbicide active. The most exciting part for Western Canada is kochia is one of these 8 herbicide-resistant weeds that Duplosan is still controlling. If you want more information on Duplosan or Oxbow and how they can help manage resistant weeds in your field, you can always go to newfarm.ca/Duplosan, that's DUPLOSAN.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Roll Radio 147 Sirius XM, brought to you by MNP. You deal with many uncertainties on your farm. Managing risk should not be one of them. MNP's Ag team specializes in risk management. Visit MNP.ca to learn how you can stay ahead of the game and plan for the unknown. MNP.ca. Okay, now we've heard from Steve Verheul. Man, such wisdom, knowledge, experience. I have so many questions for that man that is really, I could geek out for a while. But we got to get to our panel. Our panel today, up first, we have Tyler McCann. He's Managing Director at CAPI and he's on RealAg Radio quite frequently. So it's Tyler, great to see you in person.
Good to see you, Shaun.
Absolutely. Darrell Bricker is the CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs. Darrell?
Shaun, good to see you.
No, Darrell, are you based in Canada now or more in D.C.?
Toronto.
You're in Toronto.
Well, actually, I'm in an airplane.
Yeah, I can. I can identify. I think I got in like at 2:30 this morning. So yeah, life on the road. Also joining us, and I really have to ask about what happened on Saturday night. But this is Stuart Person. He is Senior Vice President of Agriculture for MNP. Hey, Stuart, how's it going?
Good. How are you, Shaun?
Good. How about those flames?
Yeah. How about those flames?
Oh, yeah.
We felt bad.
I was thinking about Stuart the whole game. Yeah. I'm just like, I showed huge restraint. Don't text Stuart. Don't rub it in. You're going to jinx it. Just leave it alone.
I think we're working on a trade deal with your team right now, so we're kind of trying to play nice.
Oh, you want our goalie? Is that what's going on?
Or your defenseman, maybe.
Maybe one of the defensemen. Okay. Well, we're a long shot for the playoffs, so you probably can have him. Okay. For a steep price. Okay, let's talk about the issue at hand here. We're at the CFA meeting, as I mentioned, brought to you by MNP. And we're talking about geopolitics. We just heard about geopolitics from a trade perspective with Steve Verheul. We're going to dig into that and extend the conversation a little bit more so. But Darrell, I want to start with you. How do Canadians, in your polling, view geopolitical impacts? Like, we hear about them, they're far away, but how does it really impact our daily lives?
Well, what we ask Canadians is whether things are headed in a good direction or a bad direction in the world, but also in our own country. And on both, Canadians today feel about as negative as, as they've ever felt. And we're certainly a pessimistic group right now. Basically, what's happened is 2019 are now the good old days. And we've gone through the pandemic, and even though we've recovered from mostly the health aspects of it, the economic consequences the world hasn't recovered from, and Canada really hasn't recovered from. So as a result, people are still very much in that almost like a daily sense of stress about what the future is going to be. So the way I would describe it is, for all of you people who were forced to take this when you were students, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where self-actualization and thinking about making the world a better place is at the top of the hierarchy, and at the bottom it's just survival. Well, what's happened is our gaze has moved down the hierarchy of needs, and our horizon has become much shorter. So we're much more focused on day-to-day just trying to get by. We will describe that as inflation, but really what people are talking about is just the cost of trying to get by on a daily basis and really feeling like the long term is next week.
Yeah.
Not feeling like the long term is 3 years from now or 5 years from now.
So Tyler, when we're creating policy, if our time horizon is getting shorter and shorter and shorter, it's really difficult to think long term from a policy perspective for government on any side of the aisle.
And I think if you look at the political dynamic around the world, a lot of the problems that we do need to solve today are long-term problems. And so we are caught in this world where people are thinking about tomorrow, but the problems that are causing the issues tomorrow aren't going to be fixed overnight. And they don't do well with short-term solutions. A lot of these are structural issues. A lot of the concerns that are driving conflict around the world, that are driving conflict from farmers, if you look at what's happening in Europe, are long-term systemic issues that are under a bit of a pressure cooker today, but need long-term systemic solutions. And it's hard to figure out how you square that circle around how do you need to do what you do today to address political and geopolitical issues, recognizing that actually we need to think longer term and we need to act longer term.
Yeah, and Stuart, for the farmer and the rancher in Canada, they're a lot of this is way out of their control, right? And we're used to that in agriculture, dealing with Mother Nature and how the impact she has on a yearly basis in terms of how big of a crop or what our livestock situation looks like. But from a on the farm financial management standpoint, how do clients protect themselves and steer through variables so out of their control? And how I like to put it is live to fight another day.
Yeah, I mean it's an issue. I would say that despite what we might think the general public is feeling, I still think there's a significant amount of optimism in the agriculture industry. We're still seeing, and the FCC put out their land value report, we're still seeing land values creep up. We're still seeing those longer-term investments. So I'd still say there's some optimism there. Maybe it's muted a little bit from where it was a year or two ago, and definitely with commodity prices going where they're going, we might see some further pullback on that. I think the biggest thing that I see in my day-to-day is the producers out there who have strong financial literacy and strong risk management planning. They have way more confidence when it comes to downturns like this, and if they're protected well, they have a lot more confidence taking advantage of those opportunities when they come up.
Yeah, we see that in our Real Agri Studies data for sure. All farmers and ranchers are not the same, and they're not the same in terms of their level of optimism and things like that. I agree with that very, very much. Tyler, are there enough tools out there for people to access, or is it a question of we got to get more people accessing the tools?
So I think it depends on what's broken that you're trying to fix with the tools, right? So if you think about geopolitical risk and how it manifests as a market risk and a commodity price risk, there are tools, strategies that are available to farmers, but to think about what are the tools that are available to Canada and to the world to fix the increasing likelihood of trade barriers and protectionism, it seems like our toolbox is pretty empty at that level these days.
Yeah. Okay. I want to get to Darrell and talk about population trends, because I know that this is one of his bailiwicks, so to speak, as my dad would say. So we're going to take a break. We are broadcasting here from the CFA meeting in Ottawa, brought to you by MMP, and we'll be right back on Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM.
Through a growing storm of kochia, cleavers, chickweed, and more, there's a clear path. Introducing Oxbow, a versatile cereal broadleaf herbicide that gets the job done. Powered by Duplisan technology, Oxbow is your workhorse on resistant kochia and other tough weeds. With flexibility in timing, rates, and recropping options, your path is clear. Find your way on the path of least resistance at newfarm.ca/Oxbow.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year, on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by BASF and Syngenta Canada.
And welcome back to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio 147 Sirius XM, brought to you by MNP. Find out more by going to mmp.ca. Our panel today is Tyler McCann, Stuart Person, and Darrell Bricker. Okay, Darrell, I want to go to you about population trends. And there's a lot of people in this room that sat through a lot of presentations for a period of time where all we heard is we need to be more productive, we need to produce more. Listen, agriculture, we got a lot of people to feed, and there's going to be 9 billion people by 2050, so get to it. Is that messaging kind of fallen off to the wayside? Because, are the numbers showing something different here in 2024?
Yeah. So at the time, you were being told there was going to be 11.2 billion people on the face of the planet, and we're going to struggle to feed them. Since then, so that was 2017, since then, the UN's put out a new estimate of what the global population is going to be in 2100, and it's down to 11.2 down to 10.4 billion people, which seems like an awful lot of people, but how much confidence do you have in an estimate in which they've adjusted it over the course of 5 years by 800 million people? It's still way too strong an estimate of what the global population is going to be. The global population is probably going to peak somewhere between 8 and 9 billion people, probably within the next 20 years. It is going to start to shrink, and how low it will go, nobody knows. And the reason for that, quite simply, is we've stopped having kids. Canada last year, and we'll just use our own example because it's the one we know best, recorded its lowest fertility rate in Canadian history last year, 1.3. And what does that mean? Well, that means during the course of a woman's lifetime, she's only having 1.3 kids. Just to replace the number of people that leave our population through that normal human biological reason we all leave the population, we need to have a birth rate of 2.1. We're almost a whole kid short of being able to just replace our population. Without immigration and without the population aging more, so we're living longer, that's the only reason the Canadian population is growing, immigration and aging. And I will tell you that every country in the Western world is going through the same thing. And many of the developing countries are also going through the same thing. So, for example, today, China's birth rate is around 1. India's birth rate is below 2. So if those two countries aren't having kids, who's having them? The answer is Africa, and there just isn't enough Africans to make up the gap that's being left by everybody else. So probably what's going to happen is we're not going to celebrate like we did last year, reaching 8 billion people or being shocked by 8 billion people. We'll never get to 9. That's where we are.
And there's been a lot of discrepancy. I haven't been the population numbers out of Stats Can. There's been a lot of controversy about how many people have been coming into the country versus what the forecasts were. It's kind of a messy ordeal.
It almost doesn't matter because even though we've got people coming in into the population at records since the end of just prior to the First World War, at record levels. I mean, depending on the numbers you look at, somewhere between 2 and 3 million people. They're not coming in at the age of 0.
Tyler?
But one thing we do know, we may not know exactly how many people are coming. One thing we do know is that they're not going to rural Canada. And we look
100% correct.
Look at the bigger geopolitical issue, but we have a political dynamic that's changing in this country today where, again, I think everybody in this room understands, less people understand agriculture than they used to before. That's a trend that's not going to change, and that's a trend that influences the politics that we operate in. It certainly influences the public policy environment. I think agriculture used to be able to get away with asking for things that probably aren't going to be able to get away with anymore. And this is a long-term decline that we're going through where I think we need to do a better job of readjusting how we think about what are our expectations from government, what kind of special treatment should agriculture get, because despite the fact that agriculture is a major employer, it is a major industry for the country, it should be one of the greatest geopolitical assets that we have as a country. The reality is that our governments, our public servants, our political players understand agriculture less than they used to, and that's really driven at its core by a population trend that's not going to change.
Can I just add one thing
go ahead,
to that? 90% of Canada's population growth over the last 20 years, and if we went back 30, maybe slightly less, is in car commuting suburbs. Agriculture's best friends are suburban voters. You need to have an alliance with them. Not downtown, suburban voters. They decide every election in this country now, and increasingly, they're going to be the dominant force in our politics. So to the degree that you can have farmers markets not downtown, but in the suburbs, good idea. The degree to which you can have outreach programs in suburban high schools rather than downtown, good idea. The more that you can bring those people to the farm and show them who you are and what they are. By the way, these are the people also having kids. You want to find places that are dead zone for kids, go downtown. So that's the group. If you're going to be aligning yourself with anybody in Canadian politics, they're the ones.
Okay, so we've hit on the fact that, for people that are coming into the country, they are not moving into rural areas. That's a problem. And we also have the industry talking about some of the labor shortages. CARC had some data out. It's staggering. The situation's not getting any better in terms of what by 2030, where we are from a shortage standpoint on labor. And in our Real Agri Studies data, Stuart, we're hearing this from farmers. One of their main concerns, Eastern Canada and Western Canada, is access to labor. We just got to figure out, we have to find a way to close this gap, or we got major problems down the road.
Yeah, 100%. There's a hope there that technology and automation will help with some of that, but it's not going to take care of the whole problem. So we do need to figure out a way to attract more people to rural Canada. And however we go about that, this group here is the group that is the major benefactor of that if we can do that. So investing in our local communities, I see lots of that going on with farmers across the country, doing things to make their communities more exciting for people to live in, really important.
Yeah. So Tyler, we heard Minister Miller a couple weeks ago talk about how, Canada, we're too addicted to cheap labor. And maybe we've got to do something about this TFW program. I launched and hit the ceiling when I heard that. What are your thoughts on that from a policy perspective and how that would impact agriculture?
It's a small piece, a big small piece of a much bigger problem around competitiveness. And what do we see as the long-term tools to improve the competitiveness of Canadian agriculture? If the government's saying that we cannot compete on wages, and they're expecting Canadian agriculture to pay substantially higher wages than other competitors, that will create a structural disadvantage. And so what I haven't heard is of the flip side is, okay, Minister Miller, if you want to take access to temporary foreign workers away, what are we going to replace it with? And how are we going to manage the impacts? And I don't think that's being thought through, just as I don't think many of the broader competitiveness issues are being thought through. And it's often a challenge and a frustration because we know these issues, right? I always struggle with competitiveness because once a year a report's going to come out talking about here are the barriers facing agriculture, here's what's holding us back. And the recommendations are often very similar. What we don't need is another report. What we don't need are more recommendations. What we need is somebody to do something about it. And I just want to touch on, so yesterday CFA heard from USDA Undersecretary Bonnie. And I really think that when you listen to not only his words, but look at what the USDA is doing, they just have a completely different frame of reference to what we see in Canada today. Their policy environment is different. He talks about it as a pragmatic partnership, and maybe the words are similar to what a lot of Canadian politicians say, but the actions are wildly different. And part of our competitiveness is understanding what's happening in the rest of the world, and we need to think more about it.
Okay, we're going to talk about Tyler brought this up. He brought up the farmer protests, and I want to make sure we got room because this is geopolitics all over it. It's very misunderstood, I find, and we got to dig into what's actually happening and what does it mean for Canadian agriculture potentially down the road. You're listening to RealAg Radio, broadcasting from the CFA meeting in Ottawa, brought to you today by MNP.
What's next for your fields? At Pioneer, delivering industry-leading genetics drives everything we do. From the scientists in the lab to our local teams with boots on the ground. We are determined to get there first. Developing top-performing products, proven in more growing conditions than ever before. Pioneer, What's next happens here. Visit pioneer.com/Canada to learn more.
Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcast. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BSF Canada.
We are having a lot of fun here in the nation's capital in Ottawa, Ontario for the CFA annual general meeting. This is the second time that we have been here. It is so much fun. I'm so glad the staff at CFA, Scott and the team, Lori and Keith on the board for having us here. We really, really do appreciate it. Our panel today is Tyler McCann, Managing Director of CAPI, Stuart Person with MMP, and Darrell Bricker, who is the CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs. Darrell, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but you told me earlier you're polling now for the U.S. election. You are polling every day.
Yeah.
That is a lot of questions.
Yeah, and we're also, even more interesting election going on right now is the European parliamentary elections, which the farmers' issues are going to be incredibly important in terms of what happens. So it's a harbinger of what's going to be happening in general. And remember what I said at the start of this about people's gaze moving down the hierarchy of needs? This is a great example of it, because it's farmers protesting over the increase in costs and the effect of regulations, mostly, interestingly, related to climate issues. Now, they're aligning themselves with more like populist-type parties, usually of the right. I would say almost exclusively from the right. But that nativist populist type of party that has been rising in Europe, the AFD in Germany, Marine Le Pen's party in France, we've seen it in Holland, we've seen it in other places, was really used to be driven by immigration. What's happening now is you're seeing the whole climate agenda, particularly from the European Parliament, now finding its way into that agenda. And the pushback is not just exclusively anymore over cultural change due to immigration, it's also being driven by the costs of climate, which we haven't seen before. So it's not just one issue, it's two issues that are merging together to really fight against what they see as an agenda of the urban elite against rural farming communities.
So what I've been saying on the show is that not all farmer protests are created equal, right? So in the Netherlands, it is very, very much about those environmental restrictions, taking land out of agricultural production, things like that. If you look at Poland, for example, it's mainly about Ukrainian grain, their words being dumped into the country. If you look at France, if you look at what's happening in Wales today, actually there's a big protest. In Wales, it's about the government reducing subsidies, which is, handouts to farmers. And farmers are saying, hey, that's making us less competitive because we're not getting this government money anymore. So Tyler, I think this is a really complex area here in terms of why everybody is actually protesting in the first place and what it's really about.
And I think that the European governments have, in part, made the bed that they're lying in today, right? They have rolled out policies without effectively engaging and consulting the producers, and that is making things worse. But I go back to often what's underneath them are structural issues that farmers need to deal with at some point in time. There's, I think, some really interesting data. If you look at the increase in yields of Canadian crops versus the increase in yields of crops in France, their wheat production, wheat yield is much higher than ours. But if you look at the trend in our wheat yield increases, it's going up. If you look at the trend of wheat yield in France, it's barely staying stable. They have structural issues that they do need to deal with, that they can argue about we need more subsidies, they can argue about we need more protectionism, they can argue about we need to get rid of sustainability policies. But at its core do get to be these issues around what do we want agriculture to look like? Do we really want it to be a rural economic development policy? Do we want it to be about sustainability? Do we want it to be about food security? And I think that the solutions to those problems are different. And I think that's part of the growing pain that they're going through in Europe today.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of changes in agriculture, and there's a lot of challenges. Let's not underscore it. And I think, Stuart, we're really kind of slowly redefining and molding, and going to be talking a lot more about what we actually want the farmer to look like going forward. Like, you and I did some research, MNP and RealAgriculture did some research work together, and there's a fairly, I think it was like 30% of farmers believe that BRM programs should guarantee a profit.
Yep.
That's different than risk management.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. We had 3 different segments in there. Some people wanted, to soften the blow. Some people wanted all their costs guaranteed, and the other group wanted a guaranteed profit. And I don't know if there's a right answer to that. I mean, we need profitable farms for the industry to be sustainable financially going forward. So we talked a lot about different geopolitical issues today, and if those are going to impact farm profitability, we need our BRM programs to be there to assist in those situations. And I think that's part of what's going on in some of these other countries as well, is whatever the climate, the political climate has, however that's impacting the economy there in the agriculture community, the farmers are not taking it sitting down.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Tyler?
I think one of the things, though, that we struggle with, and we have this perception versus reality issue at times. I think if you ask the average farmer today, how does the budget of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada compare to what it was in 2015, 2016, they'd probably say maybe spending the same, maybe spending less. The reality is Ag Canada's budget was almost 40% higher in 2022, 2023 than it was in 2015 and 2016. And I think you get back into how does that political climate play out? How do governments respond to it? That rural-urban divide. I think that those dollars are going to need to go further. I think we need to be smarter with the investments that we're making, more strategic, but that can be really tough to reconcile with protests and opposition and a perception that things are a lot tougher when the reality is there's money there. It's probably not being spent the right way.
Darrell?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting when you sit with people who really know an issue very well, like this group does. We want to see a problem in those terms. We want to see it as being driven by policy. We want to see it being driven by rational conclusions that people are making. That's not what's going on. What's going on right now is a whole bunch of people feeling like nobody is listening, that don't represent them, that don't get them, and they're pushing on an open door to fight back. And how they get there, the routes they get there, could be completely different in different places. But you have people who are living in rural and small town communities all over the world now saying there's a downtown elite who doesn't get me, seems to treat me like I'm a bad guy in every one of their movies, and they're doing things that are bad for me. So regardless of how they get there, that's how they're feeling. The challenge for organizations like this is how do you take those feelings, which are going to be expressed politically, and are being expressed politically, and channel them in a positive direction. So is there a way to kind of bring together these feelings that people have, these disparate reasons that they have for being so upset, and put them in a positive place where they can actually achieve policy change that you want to have achieved? Because right now, I would say it's completely diffuse. There are different reasons all over the place, but if you can focus it, maybe you can achieve something positive.
So, Darrell, what you just described in the motivation, what's spawning this and what's enabling it, is exactly what happened in the 2016 U.S. election. It wasn't a protest. It was the election of Donald Trump. For those exact same reasons, people feeling, the flyover states, the deplorable comments by Hillary Clinton, there's actually a lot of parallel there.
Yeah, and you see the difficulty that Joe Biden has dealing with this, because the economy is actually improving in the United States. So every time you see a Democrat on TV these days, they say two things: Trump bad, and it's not as bad as you think in your life. And the average person is going, well, if you think he's bad, maybe he's different. It's, by the way, very same situation in Canada. If you think Pierre Poilievre is so bad and the Conservatives are so bad, that must mean you're different. And if I want change, I want something different. So that's why you're seeing those kind of numbers here. It's also why you're seeing those kinds of numbers in the United States and in Europe. And that's a really interesting political dynamic that doesn't happen very often, but we're moving very much into this very disrupted change type of political environment. And the more contrary you are almost to the mainstream, the more you look like you're serious.
Yeah. Well, but it's kind of confusing, Stuart, because on one hand, agriculture has been a great industry to be in, right? We got farm values going up. We do have challenges in pockets, so please, I understand. I'm going to broad brush it. Things have been fairly good from a net income standpoint in agriculture, okay, overall. Yet there's all this frustration. Yep. And you said, hey, there's a lot of optimism for clients, farmers that you're talking to on a daily basis. There's a bit of a disconnect here from what I perceive from what some of the realities are in some cases, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we saw some stats yesterday on the presentation at the start of the day from Ag Canada that, farm values have gone up, net worths have gone up. Where a lot of the anxiety continues to be there in agriculture is that even though we do see higher net worths, it's not in cash, and so cash flow remains to be a tight issue. And things are changing faster than we've been used to. So commodity prices are jumping around a lot more than they maybe did traditionally. And so we go from one year where we're predicting, very nice profits to the next year where we're predicting losses, right? And so it's hard to make long-term decisions when you're in that environment unless you do have that, risk management in place to add to the confidence. I just want to say one thing though, to the point we were talking about earlier, and this is one thing I think the Canadian population and the Canadian government could do a better job of understanding is when we had the COVID-19 pandemic, I was on the calls with a number of you. There was a lot of anxiety and concern in the country about, are we going to have food on the shelves, right? And so agriculture got to be real important all of a sudden. Well, we should have that level of respect and importance every day. It's not just shouldn't be a pandemic that has to happen in order for us to get that level of respect. This is a very important industry. We're dependent on it for food, number one. And if you go to the climate discussion, a lot of the climate initiatives out there are also dealing with biofuels, which are also some of the things we're producing. So, I mean, why are we not getting that level of respect? I felt like the gentleman from the United States yesterday, it felt to me like the USDA has a lot of respect. And are we getting the same in Canada? I don't know.
Well, the Electoral College all feeds into that. Tyler, go ahead.
But I think if you take that comment about respect, if you take what Darrell said about we need to kind of leverage this, we need to think about how do we use this to our advantage. I think one of the things that's not clear to me is that, so we've got likely a political reset coming up, right? The agenda that's in place today in Canada is not likely to be the political agenda that's in place 2 years from now. But it's not clear to me what agriculture wants instead, right? So we know we don't want what we've got, but what do we want to replace it with? And I think that that's really a challenge for everybody to try and get their heads around. How do we articulate a clear vision with clear details, with a positive opportunity-based approach so that, okay, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. What do we replace what we've got today with?
Great stuff. Unfortunately, we have to end. Rural Radio did not give us 3 hours to do the show here today, which is really quite unfortunate. But I want to thank Tom McCann, Managing Director of CAPI, Stuart Person with MMP, also our show sponsor today, and Darrell Bricker, CEO of IPSOS Public Affairs. Thanks to all three of you for being on the show today. Listen, if you have any feedback on today's program, you can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com, or you can also call the RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. I want to thank MMP for being the sponsor, CFA for having us back here today, and this fabulous live audience. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Radio. We'll chat again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for downloading this RealAg Radio podcast brought to you by Authority Strike Herbicide from FMC. Strike twice with 2 Group 14 modes of action and take care of the toughest broadleaf weeds, including kochia, cleavers, Russian thistle, and pigweed. See your local retailer today for more information.